If you walk into a retro game store, you may see, nestled among the other loose Game Boy Advance cartridges in a display case, a copy of Marble Madness and Clax, a single cart containing handheld ports of two insanely popular arcade games from the 80s. You might find yourself drawn in by the knowledge that one of these games launched a career and led to the very existence of the PlayStation 4 itself. And when you see that this cartridge is less than $5 American, you may feel tempted to buy it. Do not buy it. A few weeks ago I talked about the Game Boy Advance and its status as a dumping ground for ports of games from the 16-bit era, a place where classics went to die and games nobody remembered got a chance to underperform in the sales charts a second time. But the Advance was much more than just another opportunity for Sega to disappoint Sonic the Hedgehog fans. It was also a veritable smorgasbord of old arcade games. Game Boy Advance ports of old arcade games made frequent appearances on store shelves in the noughties. Yes, I'm calling them the noughties, it's quicker, deal with it. Often these classics would be collected into, well, collections, sometimes themed around a particular company or franchise, other times just sort of slapped together onto a cartridge for the sake of it. Of course, handheld ports of arcade games are nothing new. The original Game Boy played host to dozens of arcade titles including Paperboy, Pac-Man, which actually got a second nicer port for the Game Boy Color, and Space Invaders, which, by the way, actually has an entirely separate Super Nintendo port tucked away on the cartridge and accessible only via a Super Game Boy. That could have been its own episode right there, but no. No, just threw it away. Threw it away. While standalone ports were very much the thing in the 80s and early 90s, compilations of classic games started to become the norm as we crept closer to the noughties, which makes sense. Why press one CD-ROM containing one port of one arcade game when you can slap a bunch of them onto a single release? Publishers spend less printing the discs, and games that might not be such big earners, such as Tubin, get bundled with games like Smash TV and Rampage, which are more likely to draw an audience. Plus, customers feel like they're getting more bang for their buck. Everybody wins. That thinking carried over to handheld ports, and with the Game Boy Advance being more or less the only game in town in the noughties for handheld enthusiasts, nobody cares about you, Neo Geo Pocket Color! A slew of classic games found their way onto the Advance as part of one of these compilation packs. Pac-Man set a strong example, taking 4 Pac-Man games and putting them out for the same price that Nintendo would later expect people to pay for a squished re-release of the NES version, while publishers DSi Games licensed a ton of Midway titles and set about cramming seemingly disparate games together into ill-defined compilations with little or no thought into which games went where. Spy Hunter and Super Sprint at least make some sense thematically, and even Paperboy and Rampage share the vague theme of gratuitous property damage, but the only thing linking Centipede, Breakout, and Warlords is that they're all games that happen to have been made by Atari. The oddest pairing of the lot, however, is Clax and Marble Madness, two great tastes that taste baffling together, released onto a single cartridge in defiance of God herself. Clax is yet another port of the 1989 arcade game by Atari where you said, and fair play to the developers, this port isn't actually terrible. I mean, it's not a great game, I'm not a fan, but as ports go, this one is fine. It's okay. It's an okay port of a gently baffling stackable brick game, and if you were a Clax aficionado circa 2005 who wanted to play this game on the toilet, this was probably the best option available to you. The real problem with this compilation lies with Marble Madness. Marble Madness originally hit arcades in 1983 and uses a trackball rather than a joystick to move the ball around the screen and into the exit before the timer runs out. It was designed by Mark Cerny, seen here. Actually, there are a lot of photos of him holding a PlayStation 4 controller. Why is that? Let me just Google this, and holy shit, he was the lead architect for the PlayStation 4?
And the PlayStation Vita.
Yeah, no, nobody cares about that, but the PS4, the guy who made Marble Madness was... Alright then. Cerny was 18 years old when he designed Marble Madness, which took arcades by storm, right up until people realised the game only had 6 levels and invariably moved on to something with a little more meat on its bones. In fact, in arcades where Atari tracked the popularity and success of the game, Marble Madness consistently fell from players' good graces after exactly 6 weeks, presumably because players would master it finish it, then never ever touch it again. This is because Atari were experiencing a bit of a financial wobble at the time, and so pushed to have the game manufactured before Cerny could design and implement more levels. Still, the game was popular enough that it got ported to a number of home systems, all with varying degrees of arcade accuracy, but specific praise was aimed at the Sega Genesis port for being the most faithful, while the Amiga version was hailed as superior even to the arcade original, despite its lack of blue balls. No, sorry, please do go on. In the handheld sphere, a Game Gear port was released with wonderfully colourful graphics and woefully terrible physics, while a slightly more monochrome but infinitely more playable version found its way onto the Game Boy. After that, it all goes a bit downhill, with a horribly lackluster Game Boy Color version having almost nothing in common with the more well-rounded Game Boy port, developed as it was by an entirely different team of people. Though apparently not by a team of people who, had actually played Marble Madness. This isn't a Game Boy Color. As disappointing as the Game Boy Color port was, it pales in comparison to the Game Boy Advance version. Yes, alright, visually it looks a lot better compared to the Game Boy and Game Gear versions by virtue of the fact that the Advance is the more powerful system, but it suffers in almost every other conceivable way. The physics are a mess, your ball rolls slowly and without purpose and frequently falls off ledges that wouldn't have presented a problem in other ports. That would make evading obstacles difficult, at least in theory, but as many of the original interactive elements didn't make it into the game, such as the wave and level 2, steering your way to the finish line is a doddle. Honestly, I can't imagine having to steer my marble through all 6 of the game's original levels, and I don't have to, because the Advanced port doesn't have all 6 levels. It only has 3. That's right, the Game Boy Advance port is missing a full 50% of the game. Once you finish the game's 3rd level, it just shows you your score, then throws up a game over message and unceremoniously dumps you back to the game's title screen. The data for those missing levels isn't even on the cartridge, the game just comes to an abrupt stop. The original Marble Madness is often criticised for its short length, but it still has its fans, people who love this game despite how quickly a seasoned player can plough through it. The Advance version, meanwhile, it's not good. It's a sloppy, unfinished mess of a port. It's barely Marble Madness, and Marble Madness was only just Marble Madness itself to begin with. So what happened? Who dropped the ball, as it were? Well, according to my sources, people who worked on the game but who wish to remain anonymous, and if I were giving hot tips like this to my show, I'd probably do the same. The company who developed this port, Frame Studios Interactive, were only given 2 months to finish both this and Paperboy and Rampage, which was similarly not good, plagued with poor controls and design choices that put them at odds with the source material. Paperboy suffers from terrible sound and dodgy controls, while Rampage feels wrong on just about every conceivable level, but Marble Madness suffered the most due to that time crunch, losing a full half of the game, and it's not Frame Studios' fault. They did the best they could with the time allotted, and my sources, they were actually quite pleased with how Clax came out, but releases like this are why port is seen as a dirty word by some, and it's hard not to feel like the entire thing was an elaborate con pulled by a publisher preying on the nostalgia of people who maybe don't know any better. It's a shame too, because Marble Madness deserves so much better than this. It's a big slice of gaming history, not just because of its brief but powerful impact in arcades, but because it launched Mark Cerny's career. From here, Cerny built a career that led to contributions to some of the most popular games of the 90s and noughties, yeah, I'm still saying it, including Sonic the Hedgehog 2, Crash Bandicoot 1, 2 and 3, Spyro the Dragon, Ratchet & Clank, Jak and Daxter, Resistance Fall of Man, Uncharted and God of War 3. If you're in the PlayStation camp, chances are that at least one of those games is in your personal top 10 games of all time, and that's before you consider his work as the architect of the PlayStation 4,
and the Vita,
yes, and the Vita, or newer games like The Last Guardian and Knack. That's an impressive career, and it all begins with this. Alright, it's not perfect and you can finish it in under 5 minutes if you know what you're doing, but it's the start of a brilliant and influential career, and for it to be farted out onto the Game Boy Advance in this incomplete manner is it's embarrassing. It's like releasing a Blu-ray of Steven Spielberg's early films compiled from bad scene rips of 3rd generation VHS copies. The only way to play Marble Madness at the moment is to buy LEGO Dimensions and the Midway Arcade Pack. That's $90 total for those of you wondering, so you have to really, really want to play Marble Madness. Or be a LEGO Dimensions completionist, I suppose. But there's no way to play it on the go. No 3DS port, no iOS or Android version, not even a port for Sony's precious PlayStation Vita. What a baffling state of affairs for a game that launched the career of a man who contributed so much to what made the 90s and the noughties such a memorable time for gaming. I'm never going to apologize for how much I said noughties in this episode. I'm not. I'm proud, frankly. I'm happy with what I've done. There we are. A little reminder that PortsCenter isn't always about good ports. Sometimes it's about really bad ones. We'll be back again with that Mega Man episode, because of course we will, and then we'll be looking at Final Fantasy VI and how Final Fantasy has transitioned across platforms over the years. And then something else after that, why not? Until then, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Do check out the other videos on Chainsawsuit Games and Chainsawsuit Original, and I will see you again in a couple of weeks.